Today is Sunday, and it's Yud Beis Cheshvan. Yesterday was Yud Aleph Cheshvan. Yeah, Shabbos we don't have classes. Yesterday was the Yortzeit of Rachel Imenu. It was the Yortzeit of Binyamin. Did you know that? It says in Sfarim, it says in Chazal. I don't know what the source is. Binyamin ben Rachel, the Yortzeit, is also Yud Aleph Cheshvan. And what's closer to us is the Yortzeit of Rav Nachum Shenabeler, and it's the Yortzeit of the Razor. The Razor is the Rebbe Rashab's older brother. The Rebbe Rashab said about his older brother, Zayn Anivas kenich eichnish. The Rebbe Rashab said about his older brother, Zayn Anivas kenich eichnish. The Razor was a very great man. He was bemis a great man. And it looks like he did things by kavona to steer people away from him towards his brother. He moved away from Lubavitch. This Kama Pratim, but this is the reality. He was his brother's chassid. He was his younger brother's chassid. Ki yadu mefursim. I just want to say something about Rav Nachum Shenabeler. Rav Nachum Shenabeler was by the Baal Shem Tov yet. Rav Nachum Shenabeler was by the Baal Shem Tov. And I mentioned this to you recently. He was an oni meduk. He was a oiskeris in the Araman. He was so poor that the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov said to the Baal Shem Tov, how could you allow one of your Talmidim to be so poor? And the Baal Shem Tov answered, Zayne Kinder will reiten in golden caratas. This was his answer. His children are going to ride in gilded carriages, which was true. Chernobyl may be, now this is a big statement, yeah. If you look at the world of Chassidus today, Chernobyl is probably the biggest. In other words, in terms of people in Chassidische Haufen, it's Eineklach, the Mezuk. They're not Rav Nachum Shenabeler or Rabbi Shenabeler, but Chernobyl is Skver. Skver is Chernobyl. Racham Strivk is Chernobyl. It's a very, very big Chassidus. It's a lange tish or a breite tish. But a lange means it will last for many generations. A breite tish should have many, many ripples. But there is a lange tish and a breite tish. I say Zogen Zeh. And the fact is, Rav Nachum Shenabeler was an incredibly big tzaddik, incredibly great tzaddik. It says in Hayem Yem that Nachum Shenabeler was shaming from Amen Yehesh Mei Rabbah. This is not a joke. A man was physically fat from saying Amen Yehesh Mei Rabbah. He was a tzaddik gomer, and of course the famous story. There's a lot of famous stories. The two famous of Nachum Shenabeler is the first ma'aseh is Alei Nent Menish, that a Maggid came to him in the middle of the night and says he's going to teach him Torah, and he said to the Maggid that he needs to ask. So the next day he came to his Rebbe, the Mezitcher Maggid, and he said that by night he was visited by a Maggid from Himmel, a Malach, who wants to teach him Torah, and he said he has to ask Rishus. So the Mezitcher Maggid said, don't go near him, he's Klipper. So when he came again, the Nachum Shenabeler said, I'm not learning with you. So the way the story is told is that this Maggid said to Nachum Shenabeler, Ich hab a bessere candidate for dir in Berlin. I have a better candidate for you in Berlin. This is Bezalel Mendelssohn, Moshe Mendelssohn. Stell sich vor. So later, the Nachum Shenabeler was asked, where did you get the presence of mind? So a Maggid kommt von Himmel, women der lernen Torah. Where did you get the Edelkeit, the bittel, to say, I want to ask? So he said, when I was young, I was orphaned. And my father remarried. And my stepmother was very jealous, because I was the oldest. And she had many children with my father, so she was quite abusive. In fact, she gave me the hardest job, she gave me the smallest food. One day he came home from Cheder famished, starving. She had made an omelet, a fine kochen, and he took his piece. He knew how much she gave him. He was the oldest, and she gave him the least. And he only took what she would give him. And she asked who took food without permission. So he said, I did, but I only took what I knew you would give me. So she said, that's true, you didn't take more. And she gave him a slap. He said, why are you slapping me? I didn't take more than I was entitled to. She said, you're right, you didn't take more. You never take yourself, you always ask. And Nachum took his head all, that you ask. And it saved him, mamish. And the zweite sipur hayadu mefursim is the ma'aseh with the tzedakah. That the Nachum Shenabeler was a Baal Choiv. He was a Rebbe, and he had a very large family. And his Eineklach Tacha were very, very famous tzaddikim in the world of Chassidei Poel. And there was never any money in the house. There was never any money. There was always debts because he fed people at Rebbe. People came to him for Shabbos. He was always feeding people. It was very expensive to be a Rebbe. You cost echet. In other words, you had to put food on the table to feed all the orchim and so on. A Yid came to the Gabbai of Reb Nachum Chernobyl and says, I'm going to be leaving by the Rebbe 300 ruble. I'm going to leave by the Rebbe 300 ruble, which is a lot of money. And the Gabbai already spent it. You understand how much is going to go for chayvus and how much is going to go for this. Anyway, after the night of Yechidus, he runs into the Rebbe to look at the dish where people used to put the money, and there's a few coins. He says, Rebbe, 300 ruble. He said, oh, so first he didn't even know what he's talking about. Until finally, it's like, Taka. He says, Taka, somebody brought me 300 ruble. And then afterwards came in a man to me, and he said he needs 300 ruble, to marry off his daughter. He says, so my first instinct was to give him the whole 300. But then I had a second instinct. Why should I give him the whole 300? I'll divide it up into 10. In other words, the idea that he should keep it for himself was never Eilal Adas. He says, I'll divide it up into parcels of 30, and I'll help 10 people. And then I asked myself, how come my first thought was to give him the whole 300, and my second thought was divided up into 10? And the tenet is, the first thought is from the Nefesh Alakis, the second thought is Nefesh Abahamis. So I gave it away before I could change my mind. Vashtei says, Reb Nachum explained to his Shamish what happened to the geld. Doesn't Reb Nachum Chernobyl. Reb Nachum Chernobyl was Alter Rebbe's Chutner. The Alter Rebbe went to make with him a shidduch. I told the story recently because he heard from the Maggid that Mashiach is going to be either from the oldest or the youngest of Talmidei HaMaggid. Reb Nachum Chernobyl was the oldest. Alter Rebbe was the youngest. Alter Rebbe went special to Chernobyl, Machmet HaMashidduch. When the chasana took place, he was already in Elam Emes, and his son, Reb Matal Chernobyl, was Mamalam Mekem Kachay. Reb Matal Chernobyl was not Shava B'Shava with the Alter Rebbe. Reb Nachum Chernobyl was an incredible supporter of the Alter Rebbe. Even when the Alter Rebbe was criticized, Reb Nachum stood with the Alter Rebbe. But his son went in the derech of Chasidei Peon. He didn't agree with the Alter Rebbe, and it was a bit uncomfortable. But I want to say this. It seems to me that the Alter Rebbe saw Reb Nachum Chernobyl almost like a Rebbe. We know that the Alter Rebbe had 3 Rebbes. The Mizitcher Maggid, the Avraham the Malach, and the Mendele Vitebsky. And it seems to me that although Reb Nachum was a chaver of the Alter Rebbe's, he passed away, he passed away between the first and second arrest. 15 years for the Alter Rebbe. He was much older than the Alter Rebbe, by the Baal Shem Tov yet. But it seems to me that the Alter Rebbe saw him in some level of being a Rebbe. Koydem Kol, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested, he said, no, not 100%. I made a mistake. Reb Nachum Chernobyl passed away between the printing of the Tanya and the first arrest, not between the first and second arrest. If Reb Nachum Chernobyl had been alive, he would have sent the pigeon. The story sent the pigeon to the Baditchever. Yeah, why did that pigeon go to the Baditchever? Because Reb Nachum had already passed away. Reb Nachum Chernobyl passed away between the printing of the Tanya, right after the Tanya was printed. A year after that, before he was arrested the first time. But the Alter Rebbe was arrested, Reb Nachum was already in El Memes. There's no doubt, had he been alive, the Alter Rebbe would have sent the pigeon to him and not to the Baditchever. I'm not chas v'sholom being memayit in the Muslim, the Baditchever, but the Nachum was much older. But by the Ma'aseh of Ve'aleya, the story of Ve'aleya, the Alter Rebbe sent a pigeon to Reb Nachum. And Reb Nachum Chernobyl, his meaning was, I told the story to you before, that it used to be Makabel Pidyanis in Mikveh. And at Rosh Hashanah, he would be in the Mikveh, and they would bring him Pidyanis. He waited, he wouldn't take a pigeon. He waited until the Shliach came from Lozhne, and the first pigeon that he took was the Alter Rebbe's pigeon. And he answered on the spot, Ich can helfen al yedei chiluf. I can help the Alter Rebbe by replacing the Alter Rebbe with somebody else. And the Alter Rebbe said, al yedei chiluf of gekent alein. That someone should pass away instead of the Alter Rebbe, I could have done myself. I wanted Reb Nachum that no one should pass away. And as the story ends, at Ve'aleya, Rabbanan Satzitkonos Ve'aleya, Tzemach Tzedek's mother gave her life. So the Alter Rebbe should live. This was Reb Nachum Chernobyl. Now why do I say that the Alter Rebbe saw him as a shtickle Rebbe? Because if you look at the Mishpachas Beis Harav, you look at the family of the Rabbeim, you see that the Alter Rebbe named his first children after his Rebbes, and his later children after his family. His oldest son was after the Mizitcher Maggid, they bear. His second son, Avraham, was after the Avraham the Malach. His third son was named after his elder Zayder and Moshe. His first grandson was Menachem Mendel. Tzemach Tzedek was his first grandson by Pashtus. He was named after the Mendel Vitebsky. The Mittel Rebbe's oldest son's name was Menachem Nochem. And he was Bepashtas named after the Chernobyl. He was born the year Chernobyl passed away. And the Alter Rebbe named his first Einikel after his Rebbe. His father was L'chei Dalgana Baruch. The name Baruch doesn't appear in the children of the Rebbe until later. The oldest son of the Mittel Rebbe was named Menachem Nochem, and Bepashtas he was named after the Chernobyl Rebbe. So there's a very strong kesher, there's no doubt about it, a very, very strong kesher between the Alter Rebbe and Reb Nochem Chernobyl. So today, yesterday was his yahrzeit, so I'm mentioning him, it'll be a schus for all of us, yeah? For us, and he had a very strong connection to the Rabbeim. The Rebbe, in Chassidus, they bring the Sefer from Eidenayim, they bring him often. And of course, the most famous quote from the Eidenayim is Ketil Mashiach. V'nocha Allah v'ruach ad Hashem, ruach chochma bin ruach da'as gvura, ruach eitzo gvura, that the pasuk goes on Mashiach. And every Yid says, v'yiskayim banu, it should be fulfilled in us, Mikra shekosla v'nocha Allah v'ruach havayis, as the Chernobyl Rebbe teaches, because by every Yid there's a nitzitz of Mashiach. And the Rebbe used to quote this very, very often from Reb Nochem Chernobyl. Okay, so anyway, so we started with, like I said, yesterday was his yahrzeit. Last week we had a discussion about what Chassidus is. I told you some stories about the Baal Shem Tov, and I brought out the Nekuda of Chassidus. The Nekuda of Chassidus, in one idea, is that you don't have to bring the Eibishter any place. You have to find the Eibishter every place. The Eibishter does not have to be brought into the world. The Eibishter has to be brought out of the world, because the truth of everything is Alakus. This is Chassidus. In Kabbalah, there's places where the Eibishter isn't. In Chassidus, there's no such thing as a place the Eibishter isn't, except a place that does not exist. More specifically, Chassidus has two Nekudas. The first Nekuda is V'ahavta l'recha kamoicha, that the deepest thing in Yiddishkeit is not Torah mitzvahs. The deepest thing in Yiddishkeit is not even Torah and the Beis HaMikdash. The deepest thing in Yiddishkeit is a Yid. And before Judaism comes a Jew. This is a very basic revolution of the Baal Shem Tov, that the highest and the deepest and the truest thing is a neshama. The biggest rasha is as choshev by the Eibush, that's the biggest tzaddik, because the nekuda pnimi is the pinta leyid, is a shchelik elakam imal mamish. And of course that's the basis for the complete revolution in the inyan of a haftal reichal kamoicha that's discussed in Tanya Perek 11 and so forth. And the other nekud is achtas Hashem, that there's no such thing as not God. The idea that Hashem creates the world every single second, and therefore there's Hashgacha Pratis, Neimim Tzemei Chaim Medav, everything that happens is directly governed by Atzmos and Hossein Shav Baruch Hu, is another expression of the Inyan HaChasidus. So again, if you have to say Chasidus in one point, it's that you don't bring the Eibishter to anything, you discover the Eibishter in everything. And when you divide it up into 2 points, it's the Inyan of the Neshama Vayid, V'ahavta Lecha Kamoicha, and the idea of Achdus Hashem, there's nothing outside of Alakus, Ein Eid Novad. So the Baal Shem Tov was given from the Eibishter the Even Tev. Baal Shem Tov was given the Pnimius HaKesed, right? The king has a crown. And inside that crown there is a stone which is the Pnimius HaKesed. And that Kesed was broken. That stone was extracted. It was ground up into a powder, fed to a dying prince to save him. This was the matana that the Eibishter gave the Baal Shem Tov, and of course the Eibishter gave it to the Baal Shem Tov, but the Baal Shem Tov should give it to all of us. As I told you at the end of last week's class, that the Baal Shem Tov as a Rebbe, and this is true of course of every Rebbe and every Nasi, had to successfully do 2 things. Number 1, he had to shepherd his flock, he had to be a Rebbe of his dog. The people he lived amongst, he had to shepherd personally. And number 2, he had to preserve what he brought into the world for posterity. He had to make it survive him, last him. And this is one of the inyanim of a Rebbe, of a Tzaddik, of a Nasi B'Yisrael, that in addition for what he does for his generation, he creates something which lasts for all generations. Ad save kol aderes. Like I've told you many times, the Rebbe said once in a note, that the Mittel Rebbe was not a Rebbe in his generation. The Mittel Rebbe was a Rebbe for his inyan for all generations. And the same is true of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was given by Atzmos and Hossein Shav Baruch Hu. The Eibishter gave the Baal Shem Tov the Even Tev Shebekesed HaMelech, and any Inyan of Chassidus, in whatever form it is, whether it's Chabad or it's Paltiel or whatever the case is the Oid or the Oid Atzmi or the Moed and the Kud of the Baal Shem Tov packaged in different ways. So now we move on to the second subject. And of course the second subject is the Eibush gave the Baal Shem Tov Chassidus, and the Baal Shem Tov had to give it to us. Chassidus was not made for big tzaddikim. Kabbalah was made for big tzaddikim. Chassidus was made for everybody. The whole union of Chassidus is that you're bringing Seidus HaTeirah, Razan Deiraisa, to Poshet the Yidden. And if you're going to bring the deeper secrets of Teirah to Poshet the Yidden, it needs to be Poshet. The Poshet the Yidden are not becoming big people because they're learning Chassidus. They're becoming little Chassidim, but Chassidim. And this, of course, is the challenge. How do you take this unbelievably powerful matana that the Eibusha gave the Baal Shem Tov to help Yidden survive the Seis Man HaGolos, the darkest and the deepest period in our Golos, with the Oir and the Koyach of Chassidus? How do you bring it to people? And this, of course, is where the diversity is. The Nekud of Chassidus is emes. But the packaging of Chassidus, how Chassidus is brought to Chassidim, changes from Chassidus to Chassidus. So we'll get to Chabad soon. Let's first talk about Chassidus HaKlolos. How was it? Of course, there's no question about it that the most important aspect of the packaging of Chassidus that gave Chassidus to Chassidim was the Rebbe himself, was Emunas Tzaddikim. The most basic tool that the Tzaddikim employed, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov himself, that a regular Yid should be warmed by the light and life and energy of Chassidus to be a Chassid, which means that his relationship to the Eibishter is not based on reason and it's not based on proof, it's based on the Neshama. It's based on Nikud, the Pintele, what's inside him, was the Tzaddik himself. That in the world of Chassidus, there were very, very holy Tzaddikim, who first of all, their presence was Gili Elokus, like it says in Sharichet Ve'emunah. What's the tight sheet of Irim? Midas Harachmim Ma'idei Tzaddikim. Where do you see godliness in the world of Tzaddik? A boss of Adam, a man of flesh and blood like anybody else, who was born and he eats and he sleeps and so on and so forth, and he's a fire. He's a piece of Eibishter. The Bilul Parashu was 2 years old, and he saw the aforementioned Nachum Chernobyl. He was 2 years old, and he was sitting on his father's shoulders, and he saw the Heilige Rebbe of Nachum Chernobyl. Atongim Shraim fire. He was a 2-year-old. And he started screaming, "I see fire." The Bilul Parashu was a Kodesh Merecha Mumelated. This was what he saw. And a tzaddik is a lukus. And when you're around the tzaddik, everybody becomes what's called a lukus b'pshitas. You have not you have answers to your questions. So get it up all akashis. When you're standing in the Aladamas of the Rebbe, there's not answers to questions. You realize how foolish and how silly and how petty it is to ask a logical question or a proof question. A mistake. If you're standing in the presence of godliness, there's no kashis. And of course, in addition to the tzaddik's presence being a gila, a representation of the lakus, of godliness, which raises a person up above the world of doubt and worry and uncertainty and so on, they were the miracles. And in the derech of Chasidei Paltiel, this was very big. The Rabbi and the Tzaddikim of Paltiel did miracles like people breathe, mamish. And some of the miracles they performed were ployim mamish, shalei piteva klal uklal, like fitzas haderech and being in more than one place at one time. There's a ribui maisis. There's enough maisis. Poshet of tchias hamesim kipshutei. Pinaploy. And when you're in such an environment and you're exposed and you're living in a world of Eisus Hamesim, so Teva is not Tefas the same Mokkah. And of course, by Chassidei Paltiel, this was a big deal. The tzaddikim and their miracles and the ikid is the storytelling. Chassidim, I grew up in Re'ei Mahuvim. Re'ei Mahuvim, when I was a child, had a table full. It must have been 20 Yidden. Well, that all had numbers on their arms. It was a regular sight. Alta Ungarische Yidden, they sat around the table. Most of them did not have beards. Their children already had beards. Some of them grew beards later in life, but they were all Tzabrachna Yidden. And they were always arguing with each other. What can I tell you? They were always screaming at each other. But they loved each other. And Every morning, it's a fact of life. Every morning, they would go into the second room. The Ema Huvim didn't look like it looks today. It was a bissel mer chodesh, and there was a little box with sponge cake. The sponge cake was so old that even us kids who were looking to steal a piece of cake wouldn't touch it. It was rock hard. You knew it was bought after Pesach, but that was it. They never ate it. They would go into the other room, and they had this little bottle of mashke. They would fill up little glasses. This is before they went to work, after davening. They opened up this box of cake. They closed up the box of cake. There was still cake in it because no one touched it, so they kept using it. Pesach, they had to destroy it. So after Pesach, there was a fresh box of cake. And they would say l'chaim. And inevitably, somebody would say, today is the yahrzeit of so-and-so. And someone else would say, today's the yahrzeit and so on. And they right away started to argue whose yahrzeit it was, and if they knew the story correctly, they were always arguing with each other. Anyway, this is what I saw as a child. And this was part of the Hasidus. In Paltiel, every day, they would connect themselves to this tzaddik or to the other tzaddik. They were never saying Tachman. They had a list of yahrzeit, and they never said Tachman. And they were connecting to tzaddikim. They would tell stories. It was a very, very serious and important part of Hasidus. And it made Hasidim. Some of these Hasidim were great people. Talmidei Chachamim and Rabbonim and Go'enim and Yerei Shamayim. And many, many of them were Poshet, they're Orim simple Jews. But they had the warmth and the chayes of Hasidus because of the tzaddikim that they were connected to and the miracles that they either saw or they heard or they repeated. This was their chayes. And then there's a third thing. In addition to the tzaddik himself, and in addition to the miracle of the tzaddik, there was the warmth, the varmkeit, hats. Chassidus always was, and it still is, certainly by Chassidei Paltiel, varmkeit, hats. Everything was emotion. Everything had to be warm and passionate and excited, and the whole life was a warm life. Everything revolved around warmth. There was a lot of singing, there was a lot of dancing, there was a lot of eating, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of fabrenging. And it was all designed to create a community of Varame Yidden, Hatz Yidden. And packaged in that Hatz was Neshama. You see, there's a very big difference between emotion and Neshama, and the soul. People somehow have simplified it. Emotions, you can have all kinds of emotions. Behemoths have emotions too. Klipa has emotions. Neshama is Getlechkeit. In the Chassidische Regesh, in the Chassidische warmth, whether it was a song, or it was a fabrengen, or it was a kiddush, or it was telling a chassidish sipur, behind that warmth was Getlechkeit, was Neshama. And this was the derech of Chassidei Paltiel, and it, to some degree, it was what the Rabbi used to call, or Rabbi calls, Chassidus HaKlolis. The Baal Shem Tov and the Mezritcher Magid were involved with different kinds of people. They had Talmidim, who were very great. The Baal Shem Tov had, the Rebbe says in a Sikha, had 60 Talmidim. The Baal Shem Tov, the Mezritcher Magid was, the Rebbe says this in a Sikha, the Baal Shem Tov, the Mezritcher Magid was given Pishnayim Beruche. Like just like Elisha got twice what Eliyahu got, the Mezritcher Magid got twice what the Baal Shem Tov got, so we had 120 members of the Charakadisha. These were Tzadikim Gedolim Mamish, Mitzuki Eretz, to whom the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid gave the Even Tov itself, gave Chasidus. And in addition, they were involved with thousands and thousands of, relatively speaking, Pashat Yidden. Some of them were very far from Pashat, but they were not Talmidim. They were not given the Even Tov, they were not given the stone itself, they were given the packaging. They were given the connection to Tzadikim, they were given the Aces or Meifsim, and they were given the Chamimos, and the Chasidus that they had was indirect. In other words, the philosophy as the Baal Shem Tov practiced it, and the Mezritcher Magid practiced it, was that he divided it up. To the biggest tzaddikim, to Yidden like Rav Nocham Chernobyl and the Heilige Baditchev Verov and so on, they gave them Chasidus itself. And to other people, directly or indirectly, the Baal Shem Tov was involved directly with Anoshim Shutim. The Mezritcher Magid was only involved with tzaddikim directly. He was involved with Anoshim Shutim through his Talmidim. They got the packaging. They didn't get Chasidus directly. And then comes the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was celebrated by the Baal Shem Tov the day he was born. As soon as the Baal Shem Tov was born, the Baal Shem Tov was Moli Simcha. The day of Baal Shem Tov's, Alter Rebbe's birth, the Baal Shem Tov is also saying they had the same birthday, Chai Yalo. The Baal Shem Tov used to celebrate his birthday in a somber mood. It was the beginning of the 12 days preparation for Rosh Hashanah. That year was like Simchas Torah. He didn't say Tachnun. He put on Big Day Shabbos. He went to the Omid, And he sang and he made an announcement. Today a neshama came into this world, which is a neshama chadash, a new neshama. And his name is Shnei Eir. And he's going to illuminate the world with two lights, the light of Nigla Teir and the light of Pnimis HaTeir. And then for the next, there were kama occasions, on his third birthday and so on, by his bris, where the Baal Shem Tov Poshet celebrated the new neshama, the Alter Rebbe. But at the same time, the Baal Shem Tov went out of his way to keep the Alter Rebbe from meeting him and from knowing about him. He wanted the Alter Rebbe not to know him, because he said to the Mezritcher Magid, is deine, the Alter Rebbe is yours. The Alter Rebbe had to be the third generation, not the second generation. These are mystical things. But the Baal Shem Tov was Mesa Nefesh, that the Alter Rebbe shouldn't know him. And of course, the Sipur that we do know is that at the age of 3, the Baruch, the Alter Rebbe's father, who was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, never thought twice. Of course, who's going to give his son his first haircut and going to give him payas and be the beginning of his chinuch, his Rebbe? And the Baal Shem Tov was very reluctant. He didn't want to do it. And he reluctantly acquiesced on the condition that the Baruch would not bring him. Because he didn't want anybody to know who the boy was. Baal Shem Tov was very worried about Ayin Hara when it came to the Alter Rebbe. So he was brought to the Baal Shem Tov by his mother and his aunt. Alter Rebbe's mother's name was Geisen Rebbetzin Rivke, and his aunt's name was Rebbetzin Dveira Leah. She was a Baruch's sister. They brought him to the Baal Shem Tov. They sat in a wagon, Sanua, and no one should see them. When the Baal Shem Tov finished davening, it was Baal Shem Tov's birthday. They were quickly ushered into the Baal Shem Tov's cheder. The Baal Shem Tov cut his hair, and he left him payas arosh, payas. He put his holy hands on his head and he gave him a bracha, and they immediately left. When they got into the wagon, the Alter Rebbe asked them who was that person. And they were told they're not allowed to tell him. The Tanya. So they tried to tell him excuses ahead, excuses ahead. The Alter Rebbe was too sharp to be dreid up. So after they ran out of excuses, one of them said, as a last effort, it is Azeda. He's Azeda. And the Alter Rebbe stopped asking. And of course, in their minds, they had tricked him. They finally placated the little boy. And when Alter Rebbe was a Rebbe, he used to call the Baal Shem Tov Zayda, based on the idea that Kol HaMalamed Et Ben Chavei Teira. If you teach Teira to another Jew, Ma'al Allah V'Akos of Kila Yolda, it's if you gave birth to him. The Baal Shem Tov was the Alter Rebbe's Rebbe. So the Mezritcher Magid was his father, which made the Baal Shem Tov his Zayda. So they didn't fool him at all. The Alter Rebbe never went to the Baal Shem Tov. He was surrounded by Chassidim. The reason is because the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, wanted that he should be makabel from his Talmud. Why, I don't know, but this was the Metzias Advan. He was surrounded by Chassidim. His father was a Chassid, his mother was a Chassid, his Zayda was a Chassid, there was Rama Ganem. His uncle was a Chassid, his aunt was a Chassid, his Malamdim were Chassidim. Alter Rebbe, as a little boy, moved from the big metropolis of Lozhne, which is a hole in the wall, to a tiny village called Lubavitch, which was a crack in the wall. Because the Baal Shem Tov didn't want Yentes, he didn't want people talking about him. In Lubavitch, he had two Malamdim, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Sachabed, who were famous in Lubavitcher lore, who were the Baal Shem Tov's Talmidim, and both of them were told that they're not allowed to mention the Baal Shem Tov's name to the Alter Rebbe. I saw in one place that the Alter Rebbe had a taina to them. Years later, how come they didn't tell him? He came to Mezritch at the age of 20. At the age of 20. When he came to Mezritch at the age of 20, he came by himself. He left home to gain Opricht and Golos. He left home to go into the world. Tzaddikim in those times had a problem because they had Teiru Gedula b'Makam Echad. The world was a world of Torah. It's impossible. It's really impossible to fathom what that generation looked like in Litte. There was so much Torah. There were Yidden in the thousands who Poshet knew Kol HaTorah Kula, who sat al HaTorah. There was a golden age. Napoleon ended that. After the Mittel Rebbe became a Rebbe, it was not the same world. I've told this to you many times. The Chassidim were not the same, and the Misnagdim were not the same. But in the times of the Alter Rebbe, it was a golden age. And the culture was that if you were rich, you wanted a chassan, a ben teireh. So the biggest Talmidei Chachamim had silver spoons in their mouths. So they didn't at all struggle. And they appreciated the deficiency in that. They saw that this is not right. A person was learning Torah and he's living in a palace. So they would, one of the things they did was to go in Golos. They would go away for 6 months or a year or two and literally wander and take nothing in their pocket. Nothing in their, they didn't take a wallet full of money and credit cards. They went with nothing. And they lived like Autumn light. And they would travel with groups of beggars and collect alms and live subsistence lives on a piece of bread. And to serve the age of B'techayni was an avodah, it was a bira. The Alter Rebbe did it also. But the Alter Rebbe said if he's walking already, he can walk in a direction. And there were two available directions. There was Mezrich and there was Vilna. The Vilna had the Vilna Gaon, who was 20 years the Alter Rebbe's senior. He was a whole generation older than the Alter Rebbe, and he rather passed away the same year as the Rebbe Nachum Chernobyl. A few weeks before, Rebbe Nachum passed away in Cheshvan, he passed away Chalameid Sukkos, also Tov Kuf Nun Ches. And there was Mezrich. And the Alter Rebbe said that in Vilna they teach how to learn. In Mezrich they teach how to daven. So lernen tenech a bissel, he said. I know how to learn a little bit. So daven and weiß ich in ganzen nit. I don't know how to daven at all. I'm going to go to the Mezrich. But he said, I'm not staying in Mezrich unless he sees also Lumdus. He came to Mezrich, stayed 3 weeks and left. Because he saw Takat Tefillah like he'd never seen in his life. But he didn't saw Torah. He forgot a kerchief. A shmata, and nostichel. He needed that shmata for whatever reasons. So he walked several days back to Mezrich to pick it up. When he returned to Mezrich and he walked into the Beis Medrash, the Mezrich and Maggid had a minyan. They davened together. The whole Chavraya Kadisha davened together. Bariches, the davening could take hours, but it was a minyan. And they were finishing davening. The Mezrich and Maggid was taking off his Rashi, Rabbi Tamson, I think. And a lady walked in with a shayla on a chicken. So the Maggid called over some of his Talmidim who were famous for their godless and Nigler, the Mendel Vitebsker, the Avram Kalasker, and others, the Baditch Verov. And they started a pilpul on the chicken. The Alter Rebbe listened to the pilpul on the chicken. The Alter Rebbe said, you know what? I'm going to stick around. They can find London. And he stayed. Once he made the decision to stay, he made an appointment to go in and see the Maggid. So he came into the Maggid with his list of problems. You know, they have an Agdama of Tanya, we're going to see soon. Nigel Lovovim, the Tzoros from Azelcha mentioned. We know two things that the Alter Rebbe came with to Tanya to Mezrich. One Tanya was that never in his life did he harave. Never in his life did he work hard on anything. Everything came easy to him, and he felt like lo yagaitu motzasa al tam, and he felt like he's pashat missing because there was no yagir. And the second issue was that he never had a rebbe. He never had a teacher. He was a self-made man because he was greater than all of his rebbes. And as the Friedrich Rebbe describes it, the Alter Rebbe got in Mezrich more than he could have dreamed. The Mezrich Maggid was the Alter Rebbe's Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe was therefore so miyaked the Mezrich Maggid because the Mezrich Maggid was his Rebbe. In other words, the Mezrich Maggid was great enough, if you could imagine such a thing, to be the teacher of the Alter Rebbe in Inyanim Pnimi. Not he taught him how to read. But when he came into the Alter to the Mezrich Maggid, as much as the Alter Rebbe had to say, the Maggid had twice as much to say. And the Mezrich Maggid told the Alter Rebbe, I have been waiting for you for years. And he proceeded to tell the Alter Rebbe all kinds of things that the Baal Shem Tov had said to the Maggid to tell the Alter Rebbe. But the Nekuda was that Baal Shem Tov said to the Maggid, Ich habe gehabt Mesiras Nefesh, soll mich nicht kennen. I sacrifice. I had Mesiras Nefesh, he shouldn't know me. Is deiner. He's your property. He's yours. Aber du wirst davon warten, bis wird kommen zu dir allein. You can't go get him. He needs to come and needs to come on his own. And this was the whole thing. The Maggid waited for 5 years, and the Alter Rebbe came, and the Alter Rebbe left. And Bashgocha Yena or Bashgocha Tachtena, or by a combination of Bashgochas, he came back. And the Alter Rebbe became a Talmud of the Mezrich Maggid. And he proceeded to tell him all kinds of messages from the Baal Shem Tov, beginning with who his neshama was, that he was a neshama chadasha, and so on. And amongst the basic messages that the Mezrich Maggid gave the Alter Rebbe from the Baal Shem Tov is that he has a unique task. Arayin to bring Chassidus and Apnimius. The Baal Shem Tov didn't say that he should create Chassidus Chabad. The Baal Shem Tov's message was that he should make Chassidus something which can be internalized. In other words, what is the theme of today's class as opposed to last week's class? Last week we talked about what Chassidus is. The discussion of today is how to package Chassidus. Chassidus is a Eir Atzmi. Chassidus is a godly power. And you have to bring it to Chassidim. You have to make people be able to be lifted up and to live by the principles of Chassidus. In other words, live by the principles of Holocaust B'Pshitus. Not to have answers to questions, have no questions in the first place. And that comes from the Neshama, from the Yechidish B'Nefesh. And the trick of Chassidus is to find a way to bring Chassidus to people. So in the derech of Chasidus HaKlolis and Chasidei Poilin, I mentioned to you a number of points, the tzaddikim and the moifsim and the chamimos and so on. The Alter Rebbe was given a unique task. He was told a short message. Your shlichus on this earth is to create a pnimius Chasidus. How do I translate the pnimius Chasidus? It's difficult for me to translate it. So I'll put it to you in these words. A Chasidus where every Chassid can be self-made. Where the Chasidus is not based on the direct relationship between the Chassid and the Rebbe, but that the Rebbe gives the Chassid Chasidus, and the Chassid makes himself into a Chassid, a pneumistic Chasidus. This was the message the Mezritcher Maggid gave the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov. Now understand this. The Alter Rebbe in his lifetime did incredible things, amazing, many things. Alter Rebbe is one of the most successful Gedolei Yisrael in history. People don't realize it. Alter Rebbe made a new Shulchan Aruch. Alter Rebbe made a new Sefer of Musar called Tanya. But the Alter Rebbe made a Nusach HaTfilah. How many people in the history of the world wrote a Siddur? A Siddur. And we know exactly who made it. Alter Rebbe was Magia, the Siddur, word for word, letter for letter, Mesek for Mesek, Nekuda for Nekuda. Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe made all the Shiurim over again. What's an Ammon, what's an Etzban, what's an Aviyasam, what's a Kazayas. Alter Rebbe was incredibly original in everything. Everything he touched, he recreated. Alter Rebbe has a new Kesher Shel film. Alter Rebbe has new Oisius of Allah Beis of Stam. There's not anything that Alter Rebbe didn't touch. And everything he touched turned into gold. He was an incredibly successful man. Unbelievably, that a letter from the Rebbe to somebody, if you add up what the Alter Rebbe accomplished in his lifetime, he's a man of wonder. Wunderbar. But all the things that he did were secondary. In other words, he had a shlichus from his Rebbe. And of course, every chassid, and certainly every Rebbe is mitzias, is to do what his Rebbe tells him. And all the other things were byproducts of that. What was the ikir? What was Alter Rebbe's neshama's purpose on this earth? To create a chasidus that can be internalized. And the Alter Rebbe decided to create what we call today Chasidus Chabad. Chochma v'nevadas. To create a chasidus where the Even Toiv Shebekesed HaMelech, this precious stone, which is the pnimius of the crown of the Eivishter, which has been broken out and ground into a powder and fed the people so that Yidden should survive, the Alter Rebbe's packaging was Chochma v'nevadas, the human mind. Not to go directly to the heart, from the neshama of the tzaddik to the heart of the chassid, but to go from the neshama of the tzaddik to the mind of the chassid. Because the Alter Rebbe wanted that Chasidus should come to the chassid in such a way that it's his own. Like you have in Ayem Yem, that the Alter Rebbe was the consummate Mechayim Mesa. The greatest resurrector of the dead is the Alter Rebbe. Why? There's nothing more lifeless than Kalta Seichel, than a cold intellect. And the Alter Rebbe made a moyach hakeli for Lakus. Then when you learn Chasidus, and especially if you actually bring the Chasidus into your heart through meditation and contemplation and so on, Chasidus comes to you. What's Chasidus? Alakus. Chasidus is not philosophy. Chasidus is not even mysticism. It's godliness. It's fire that exists in the heart and soul of every single Jew. And through the process of Chochma Bina Vadas, you don't bring Chasidus into yourself. You use the Chasidus as a means of triggering, of revealing the Chasidus which is inside. The Neshama, the Pintliya, the Yechidah Shabanefesh. And this was the Alter Rebbe's big Mesidus Nefesh. He spent 40 years of his life, or 30 years of his life, or 25 years of his life, depending on how you count his Rabbistve. And in the Sichas of the Frierdiker Rebbe, you have all of these numbers, inventing a new packaging for the same Even Teir that the Eibush gave the Baal Shem Tov. A packaging which changes the relationship between the Chassid and the Rebbe. The Chassid does not go to the Rebbe to be uplifted. The Chassid goes to the Rebbe to be educated. And the work you do your own. This is Chochma Bina Vadas, Chabad. And again, Chasidus Chabad is not a philosophy, it's not a Kabbalah. It's a Torah that has inside of itself Eir Abba, Eir Atzmi, Alakus. And the learning of this Torah alone, especially if you learn the Torah in a way that you bring it out into your heart, wakes up a pintalid, wakes up a Yiddish neshama. I remember seeing years ago, as a Bachayet, an interview with Harav Mendel Feldman Alav Shalom. The Mendel Feldman was a Rav in Baltimore, in the non-Lubavitcher shul. The Mendel Feldman was an old-time Chabad Chassid, a Lubavitcher Chassid. He was an Eidim at Eliyahu Simpson, who was from the Gedolei Chassidim, Gedolei Tmimim. And Mendel Feldman was a big Lamdan. And I remember I was young, I was a teenager. And of course, as a teenager, everything is very simple, and you know everything already. That in the course of this interview, they asked him the question, how are you Makarev a Yid? How are you Makarev a Yid? He said, very simple, one answer. Tanya. And I remember thinking how simplistic that was, you know. I was thinking about Kishke and Kugel and L'chaim and Shiklis and Tanya. You sit down with a Yid and learn Tanya. Now, of course, the ganze Welt schreit, that's where you start, with Tanya. Start with Bereshis Bara L'kim. Or the Misnagdim would say, start with a Shtikele Gemara, with Tanya. And the teretz is, it works. You know, there's an interview from Jam now with Tendler. Harav David Moshe Tendler. He's the son-in-law of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a Gadol Yisrael. And he had a 7-hour Yechidus with the Rebbe. And in the course of that Yechidus, they discussed many things, and one of them was Taras HaMishpacha. And he argued with the Rebbe. He said, in today's climate, Taras HaMishpacha is a difficult mitzvah. And the Rebbe said, you're wrong. It's an easy mitzvah. People are desperate for clarity. And if you'll teach people Taras HaMishpacha, they'll forget. It's the quickest way to make people from. And he said, and the Rebbe was right. He argued with the Rebbe. It didn't make sense. Tara in America, it's a cesspool. And the Rebbe says, no, it's a chatlegen. Why? Because everybody has an neshama. And I'm applying that conversation to the Tanya. Tanya works. It doesn't make sense. It works. When you sit down with a Yid and you learn Tanya, and you sit there, you're reading Nefshel Kis, Nefshah Bahamis, Akasha Hin, Akasha Head. It wakes up the neshama. It's not waking up his neshama because you're a good teacher and you're giving a good philosophy. It's waking up the neshama because the Tanya is godliness and a Yid is godliness, and they recognize each other. In other words, it doesn't really matter what pay. Tanya works. Why does it work? Because the Eibishter is in the Tanya, and the Eibishter is in a Yid, and when you connect one shtickle Eibishter to another shtickle Eibishter, you have a fire. So it's true, the Tanya is an incredible book, with great psychology, as we love to say in our sick culture, and some philosophy also, and a little Kabbalah, and there's also, forget it, if you haven't forgotten yet, something called Avoida, V'medavdin in the Eibishter. But above all else, the Eibishter, the Bezitch said about the Tanya, how do you put such a great God to such a little book? The Rebbe used to repeat it, and the Rebbe said, it wasn't said by me or by you, it was said by the Bezitch. Veratach gesagt. How do you put the great God that claim for that Sefer? The Tanya always came out in a small format until Tafshin Mem Tes. The Rebbe allowed for the first time they should print the Tanya a regular size. When Ashag passed away, they printed in his apartment a Tanya the size of a regular Sefer. But until Tafshin Mem Tes, the Tanya was always small. And I believe this is the reason, because the Baditch Verov said, the great God and Aklein Sefer. In Tanya you have Eibishter. And this is what the Alter Rebbe gave. The Alter Rebbe didn't create Chasidus. Chasidus is the Baal Shem Tov. And what is Chasidus? Chasidus is the Evantage, it's a Iratzmi. It's a godly fire that connects a Yid to the Eibishter and bypasses the ganze Elam Hazeh. It bypasses the brain, it bypasses the heart, it bypasses the ego, it bypasses the senses. It's Getlichkeit. And if anybody thinks you're going to fancy up Chasidus and modernize Chasidus, either it isn't fancy or it isn't modern or it isn't Chasidus. Chasidus is Alakus. It's Getlichkeit. The Seichel is not Chas v'Sholom a Metzias. The Chochma Bina Vadas in Chasidus is fire. And this is especially true in the Tanya. And this is the Alter Rebbe's gift to us. Alter Rebbe was given a shlichus, and he did many other things in his lifetime, by direct instruction from his Rebbe, by indirect instruction from his Rebbe. But what was his shlichus? What was the primary purpose which his neshama came into this world? As he was told by his Rebbe, and the message from his Rebbe's Rebbe, Rein to bring a Chassidus, to create a Chassidus where the relationship between the Chassid and Chassidus is direct. It's not that the Rebbe has Chassidus, and the Chassid goes to the Rebbe to be inspired by the Rebbe's light, but the Rebbe gives the Chassidus itself to the Chassid, and he gives the Chassidus to the Chassid in Moya, Chochma Bina Vadas. You could learn Chassidus. Chassidus Varem, Chassidus Heiptuch. There's an old expression that says, Mashke daf machen Meshugeh, Geld, Mashke daf machen Shikir, Geld daf machen Shikir. Mishugge und Chassidus darf machen nach Chassid. Nu, am trinkt Maschke, es nicht schicke. Am hat Geld, es nicht Mishugge. Man lernt Chassidus. Nicht Chassid darf man haben noch ein bisschen. That's all. You understand? In other words, alcohol makes you drunk. Money makes you insane. Chassidus makes you a Chassid. What if you drank alcohol, you're not drunk? You have money, you're not crazy yet. You learn Chassidus, not a Chassid, you just need a little more. This is Chassidus. This is the Alter Rebbe, this is a gift of the Alter Rebbe. Chassidus Chabad. And this is what we're going to be learning, Tanya, Mr. Hashem. And the Tanya is that. You use your brain to understand Getlichkeit, and what we're after is not philosophy. What we're after is what they called in the olden days, der Head and Getlichkeit. That head. That godliness should make sense to us. We need to appreciate that one of the greatest halamas vestadim of the modern times, one of the biggest concealments of the last few hundred years, is the klip of seich, logic, intellect, proof, understanding. And it breaks my heart every time I hear a person say that this is Chassidus Chabad, because it's a sheker muchlat. There is no relationship whatsoever between secular intellectualism or intellectualism of any kind and Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe did not come into this world to answer questions. The Alter Rebbe did not come into the world to have debates. The Alter Rebbe did not come into the world to make any proofs. The Alter Rebbe came into this world to raise you above. And that's Chassidus. There's a world of arguments. Proof ahin, proof ahead. How old is the world? How old is the monkeys? When did the monkeys become people? Are the people people? Are they reverting back to monkeys? Chassidus doesn't engage in that. I've said this to people 1,000 times. You will never ever find a proof for anything in Chassidus. Chassidus doesn't prove anything to you. You want proofs? Learn philosophy. Chassidus Chabad is not philosophy. Not one drop. Chassidus Chabad is Chassidus. It's a lukus. And the point is it raises you higher. You will sich verplanten and you want to sit in the cesspool of proof and counterproof and argument and logic and shmagic. It's a Gehenna. It's a Gehenna. If you want to be a Fruma Yid and engage on that level, you're in a hell you cannot escape. Because it never finishes. There's so much klipa, it's so burdensome, it's so heavy. Right? The Rambam answered Seichel with Seichel. Because in times of the Rambam, you could answer Seichel with Seichel. The Baal Shem Tov did not answer Seichel with Seichel. The Baal Shem Tov answered Seichel with a lakus. And the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus Chabad is exactly the same. It's an answering Seichel with a lakus. Not Chochma Bina Vadas. It's not intellect. Chochma Bina Vadas is bringing to a Yid God. That's the point. And that's the emes. When you're learning Tanya, you're not trying to understand philosophy. You're trying to use your mind as a vehicle, as a bridge, as a key to reach not just your heart, but to reach your neshama. And that's what it means in that Yem Yem, that the Alter Rebbe was a Mechaya Mesa. He took the mind and made it a Keli for Lakus. The Alter Rebbe wasn't afraid of the Seichel. He made a Keli for Lakus. Now I want to stop. I want to do a Yem Yem, which we haven't done in a long time. But I want to tell you a story. And I'm going to finish the Hagdama with this. And next week we're going to start learning the Hagdama proper. There's a book, it's now published. You can buy all of these Svarim. There was a Yid by the name of Harav Meir Blazinski. Harav Meir Blazinski passed away, I think, in the 1980s. Tafshin Mandala or something like this. He has a lot of children and grandchildren. There's a lot of Lubavitchers of his descendants. They're not all named Blazinski. There's a lot of daughters and so on. Harav Meir Blazinski lived in Varsha. And he did not come from a Lubavitcher home. He came from another Chassidus. And in his biography it says who the family's Rebbe was. Now I read it in his book. And then I heard confirmation with more details from one of his grandchildren, his daughter's son, who told me this himself. In the years between World War I and World War II, Poland was in terrible upheaval. Terrible upheaval. I compare Russia and Poland to Spain and Portugal. You know the history of Spain? For 100 years, Jews were persecuted and tortured until they finally expelled them. 100 years. No one realizes. 1391 it started. The expulsion was 1492. Portuguese Jews suffered for 5 years. From 1492 until 1497 when they expelled Portuguese Jews. But in those 5 years they made up the cruelty of the Portuguese authority over the Jews was so unbelievable that in a few years they added up to the tzodas that Yidden had in Spain 100 years. Yidden in Russia suffered terribly. Yidden in Poland under Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph was the king of Austria-Hungary, was very good to the Jews. Pasha to Erev Yisrael. He died in the middle of World War I. The guy forgot to die. He was a king for over 60 years. And he protected Yidden. But what happened between World War I and World War II, when they created Poland as a way of punishing the Germans, was an anti-Semitic surge, which is equal to the Holocaust almost. And the number of Yidden who left Yiddishkeit in that period is millions. Millions. Galicianer Yidden sind gewinnt froh. But the rate of assimilation was unbelievable. And ein bias such an ein shames, mamish. There was incredible poverty. They looked at a Fruma Yid and the yeshiva bach as worse than a rodent. And it was a very, very, very difficult time. So the Meir Blazinski was a yeshiva bach. And his Rebbe was a tzaddik. His Rebbe was a Bamoifis. And this Rebbe, in his own children and grandchildren, he couldn't keep them from. The Meir Blazinski was in a Bismedrish, in a shul, and he overheard a shiur between two Yidden. One of the Yid that Gehasen of 5 years Zalmanov, he was Alban Shchasa Atonin, and he was learning with Nocha Yidden Tanya, Sachakel. And he overheard the learning, and it appealed. He was 14, and it appealed to him. He was an intellectual boy. He was a philosophical mind, and this it resonated with him. It worked for him. So after a few times of standing on the side, he asked to join. He asked to make a shiur, and in a short time, they had a kibbutz of 15 bachrim learning Tanya. And his mother's Rebbe warned him, "You have to stop learning Kabbalah." He says, "I'm not learning Kabbalah, I'm learning Chassidus." No, Tanya's Kabbalah. What the Hemshech HaSipur? There was a Yid, Brandwein, he was the Sulam. He's a whole derech in Kabbalah that he had. He also lived in Varsha. And for some reason, his Kabbalah was kosher. Tanya's treif, I can't understand it. And they brought this Meir Blazinski to this Yid, Brandwein. He was the one who wrote the Pirush Hamzeh called Sulam. As Omtam Reiden. He should be Makarev him. Chas v'shalom to learn Tanya. And it didn't work. It didn't work. He wanted Chassidus Chabad. They made him Chatmimim in Varsha and Peyal. They started a yeshiva. When he got married, he took his entire dowry and gave it away to support the yeshiva. Unfortunately, the yeshiva closed anyway, and it didn't reopen until the Frierdiker Rebbe came. But when the Frierdiker Rebbe saw the first Tmimim in Poland, he was so impressed. The Frierdiker Rebbe Pashut felt like they're great, like the Lubavitch. The Frierdiker Rebbe, but the Rebbe's Chassaneh, the Rebbe was so excited about the Tem Chatmimim in Varsha, mamish like Lubavitch. Anyway, the Hemshech HaSipur is that this Rebbe Meir Blazinski was about 14 or 15 years old, and he got sick. And he almost died. It's a true story. And his mother ran to his Rebbe and said, "Rebbe Ratevet, my son is dying." He says, "Let him commit to stop learning Kabbalah, and he's healthy in a minute." So she came to her son and pleaded with him that he should agree to stop learning Chassidus, Tanya. So he said he needs 2 hours to think it over. 2 hours. She came back to him 2 hours later, and he said, "I'm not committed. If I lose my life, I lose my life. Chabad is my derech." As soon as he said that, he felt a surge of health. And he recovered, and he lived into his 80s. And he was makar of many, many years into Chassidus. And in his heart, the way he felt was that when he made that commitment that he's going to be Mesa Nefesh, Kipshute, to learn Chassidus Chabad, he went over from one tzaddik to the Frierdiker Rebbe. And now he had a new Rebbe. I can't understand the fear of the Tanya. It's the most irrational thing. And it's not only amongst Misnag, amongst Chassidim also. Tanya, everybody's afraid as if the Tanya is some poison book. It Pashut doesn't make sense. I have a former student of Zayin Gesundheitstak, she's a shliach. So she, on her journey, was once an assistant to a conservative rabbi. She can lay better than anybody, you understand? She taught all the boys and the girls the Haftorah and the Kriyas Latera out for the bills. She's a very bright girl. And she met a shliach in California, in Northern California, and she was learning Tanya. So she walks into the library in the conservative temple of a beautiful library of brand new, unused books. And she's looking and looking and looking. So the rabbi walks in and calls her by her Goyish name, which I don't know. And says, what are you looking for? She says, oh, I'm looking for our copy of the Tanya. So the man starts to shake. That's a dangerous book. We don't have a book like that in our library, and you should stop learning it. I said, what's dangerous? If she would learn Zohar, he wouldn't say a word. Nishkavat. If he would learn almost anything else, there's this incredible aversion to Tanya. The Gerer Rebbe, the Beis Yisrael, walked into a shtibel in Yerushalayim, and he sees Bachram learning Tanya. So he walks over to them and says, which yeshiva do you learn? He said, we're learning in Kel Teira. You're famous yeshiva Shalom. Why are you sitting here? Because the yeshiva doesn't let us learn Tanya. And he got really upset. He says, the rate of letter came in lane and just 2 minutes. The Gerer Rebbe was very against reading newspapers. He says, they can read a paper, but they're not allowed to learn Tanya. And he called Harav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he told him what he felt about it. And they were allowed to have a shir in the yeshiva, but also had to be Batzniya Alech. For some reason, everybody knows the power of the Tanya, and you see it more than in any other way, and the fear of it. What are you afraid? You're going to learn Tanya. They'll teach you Tanya by themselves, but Chas v'Sholom, you should get Tanya from someone who's learned Chassidus Chabad. They almost know a person's going to learn Tanya, he's finished. What's finished? You become a chassid. That's the koyach of the Tanya. I can't make sense out of it. For the life of me, what are you so afraid of? What's going to happen? And the teretz is because it has in it fire. And the fire of the Tanya transforms. And to use a psychological term, you can't control it. It's not brain, it's neshama. You cannot control it. You can't manage it. And Ma'az L'Chazah, they have a sense that this book can have effect on a person that you can't keep in a box, can't control it. And that's the emes of Tanya. And this is the matan that the Alter Rebbe gave us. And Bli Neder, next week we'll actually learn the Tanya. Okay.